Hi, everyone. Welcome back to What They Don't Say. I'm Shannon, and today Lauren and I sit down with somebody who has truly become a friend of the show. His name is Dave Markel. Now, Dave is a retired police detective who now has his own podcast called Sexual Assault Survivor Stories, aka SASS. This episode with Dave is what we call a pod share, which means that we sat down, we recorded one episode together, we each edited it separately and are uploading it to our own feeds. With that being said, I highly recommend that you check out his podcast. He has tons of episodes with survivors and professionals diving into their stories and giving really helpful information, especially if you're a survivor of sexual assault on the healing journey. He is a great resource for you. He's awesome. He is one of the kindest people I've ever met. On this episode, we talk a little bit about our trauma. We give actual backstories to who we are, which is something that we've never done before on this podcast, which is kind of funny considering we've been doing it for almost 2 years now. With that being said, I hope you guys enjoyed this episode. Let's get into our conversation with Dave Markel.
Ladies, Lauren, Shannon, thank you so much for being here with me.
Yeah, of course. We're happy to be here.
It's going to be tricky because I don't use video and I know you guys do. The one who just spoke was Lauren. And so if you want to kind of get her voice in your head so you know when she's talking, and Shannon hasn't said much other than
hi. Hello, everyone. Lovely to meet you via this podcast.
Do we sound similar? Our voices?
You sound very similar.
Yeah, that makes sense. Well, we are related, so.
Yeah, and that's an interesting aspect of your podcast and one of the things I was eventually going to want to get into. Let's just basically start out with some background from both of you, and then I'll give your listeners some background about me. I'll let Shannon talk first because she hasn't said much. Shannon, tell us about yourself.
Well, I grew up in Albuquerque, New Mexico. I think that's one of my more fun facts because usually when I meet people, they say, oh, I've never met anybody from New Mexico. So there I am being representative of my people. I felt like a lot of my life was spent in an ice rink. I was a figure skater for over 16 years. It was my dream, my love. Thought I was going to do it forever. And ultimately, I ended up moving to Colorado Springs to do it full time. Skating always came first. It was skating before friends, before school, before social life, anything like that. Whenever I start telling like who I am, my inclination is to start talking about all the trauma I've experienced. But I don't know if that's actually what you're looking for. So I will skip some of it, maybe.
I think whatever you talk about is absolutely wonderful. And I'm just going to tell my audience right now, Lauren and Shannon and I have been talking before I just did this short little intro for about 30 minutes. And we've gone over a whole lot of things. So this isn't one of them, though. And that's an interesting fact that you start talking about who you are and what your past is. And you have this tendency to lean towards the trauma. And yeah. I'm guessing when you said that, correct me if I'm wrong, that a lot of your trauma is skating related trauma?
Actually, no. I think that I escaped skating pretty unscathed. I don't think I've ever had any serious eating disorders. I think that I definitely lived under like a lot of stress and pressure every day. I was skating all day, every day, 6 days a week for over 16 years of my life. I wanted to go to the Olympics. Both my parents are Olympians, so that was like, I wanted to fulfill that dream goal. And then everything really stopped for me when I was assaulted because all of a sudden I had no capacity to be an athlete. Like I didn't have capacity to brush my teeth, let alone try to be an Olympic athlete. Like that's just not possible. And so I really had to like shift what I wanted my life to look like. And I went to college and just wanted to be a normal person. A lot of, I guess, like who I am and how I got here now is just trying to figure out who I was outside of a sport that was, I think, kind of taken away from me by someone assaulting me. But I attended the University of Colorado Boulder and I absolutely loved it. I loved being a normal person. I loved that I went from being so stressed, like physically and emotionally each day with skating, to being a student. And my biggest stress was like studying for an exam. Like I just felt this big weight lifted off of my shoulders almost when I quit, even though it was kind of outside of what I had really wanted. But I studied marketing and I met a great group of people. Like I think my people that I'll be friends with for hopefully the rest of my life. And currently I'm living in Denver. That's how I got here.
and I'm just going to interject real quickly. A lot of my audience already knows this, but I lived in Boulder for a while. I have a huge love in my heart for Boulder and Boulder County in general. And my law enforcement career was in Lafayette, which is 12 miles east of Boulder. Much of what I did as a cop happened in Boulder. So yeah, it's a great little summary that you've given us, and I appreciate that. But it's leading to all these kinds of questions that are going to come up later as we talk.
Just my little word vomit.
I love that. That's good. Word vomit.
Dave, you're so funny.
I'm hilarious. Watch me edit that out.
I think
You should.
Lauren, talk to us about you.
Yeah, it's my turn to word vomit. I grew up in San Francisco Bay Area. Yeah, I was not a figure skater for most of my life, but I did start figure skating before Shannon did. I just didn't keep it up.
Oh.
That's my fun fact about that. My life was pretty defined by my love for environmentalism. I decided at 8 years old that I wanted to be in the environmental field. I discovered plastic pollution and I decided, wow, humanity sucks and I need to do something about it. Yeah, a lot of my life was really focused on that. Even in like middle school and high school, I'd always do like environmental science research projects and things like that. And I always knew that when I got into college, I wanted to focus on that. But then I also, was a competitive soccer player, played a lot of sports, was kind of a typical like high school life within that. But yeah, like Shannon mentioned, like we have a lot of athletes in our family. So there's a lot of competitive nature in our blood for sure. That was a big part of like who I was. I continued that through college. I was on my college's climbing team, which was really fun and a really different experience. So that was also something that has defined a lot of my life and just like outdoor sports in general and skiing and things like that. So after I graduated undergrad, I kind of knew I wanted to be in a space where I just had a lot of access to the outdoors, but could also just further my education. So that's when I moved out to Boulder and I attended CU and I got my master's in environmental policy. I decided to stay. I just graduated this past year from that. Man, I don't know what else to say. This is like, this is hard.
It is hard. And I struggle with it every time somebody says, tell us about your background. And like, where do I start? You touched earlier on the fact that Lauren, you and Shannon are related. So just briefly explain that to the audience.
We are cousins. My father and Shannon's mother are siblings.
It's one of three. So we have another uncle and another set of cousins. And my mom is the oldest one. And I would say viciously different than the other two, than her brothers.
But whenever the cousins get together, Shannon's in charge because her mom's the oldest.
So everybody else grew up like in the Bay Area. And I was like the only cousin that didn't grow up there. So I felt like they all like bonded, and then I would come in and be like the weird one from New Mexico. And now since we've gotten older, things have shifted a bit, especially getting to spend, like a year living in the same place as Lauren, because her grad school overlapped with my undergrad, my senior year. And so that was like really, really awesome to be in the same place as a family member. Like I felt like a sense of FOMO, like fear of missing out with the family a lot. And so that was kind of a way to heal that very, not a big traumatic thing. Okay. Just a very small thing.
And it's interesting that you grew up in Albuquerque and the rest of the family grew up in the San Francisco Bay Area. They couldn't even spell Albuquerque.
I bet you still couldn't, Lauren.
I bet that I could. Okay.
Okay. Well, do it on the air.
Yep, here you go.
Oh, this is a lot of pressure.
Spent a lot of time in New Mexico. I was raised in a kind of an evangelical Bible thumping family. And the Bible camp I grew up in was in Glenwood, New Mexico.
Wow.
Southwest Bible Camp. And a lot of the people that came to Southwest Bible Camp were from the same evangelical assembly sister church in Albuquerque that we were from in El Paso. So I knew a lot of people in Albuquerque, and it's ALBUQUERQUE.
Good job, Dave. That was correct. Could you tell us a little bit about yourself and whatever traumatic events you choose to share or not share?
I would be happy to. It was a traumatic experience growing up. Even though I had that church background, my father was very abusive. I grew up physically abused and emotionally abused quite a bit. And it wasn't just me, although I was the third child of four. My younger sibling, who recently passed away just a little over a year ago, had cerebral palsy. And so he was ambulatory, but he wasn't high functioning. My next sibling up was my sister, who is alive, and I'm very, very close to her. The oldest sibling was my brother Tom, and he passed away almost 5 years ago now. Very suddenly. It was strange death. He was just laying in bed watching TV with his wife and jerked, and she said, "What's wrong?" And he said, "I don't know," and then died.
Oh my
And
gosh.
after high school, I graduated from Eastwood High and went right to Baylor University and had this aspiration of being an opera singer. I was a music major with voice performance emphasis, and I quit after 2.5 years before they kicked me out. And the reason they were about to kick me out is because I was a great singer. I still consider myself a pretty good singer, but I suck as a musician in terms of everything else.
Come on, Dave, prove it.
I'll fall back on the fact that I'm not feeling great. I feel this cold coming on. Sorry.
I believe you.
You don't have to make excuses.
Yeah.
I'm just hearing excuses.
It's also hard to sing for me. It's hard to sing a cappella. After I dropped out of Baylor, well, I moved back home to El Paso, worked for my dad. He owned an office supply store, and I worked there in the warehouse for almost a year and couldn't stand it and said, I've got to go be a musician somewhere. I've got to sing somehow. And I moved to California with the idea of becoming a studio singer, like a background singer, or finding somebody who thought I sang as good as I thought I sang and would do a contract with me or something. So I went out there, sang at a big church because of the choir director. He was very famous in the Southern California area. His name was Jack Coleman, passed away many years ago, but Jack was a freelance producer, songwriter, choral conductor, singer, just an amazing man. And he put me in a group called The Number of Grace. There were 7 of us, and we traveled all over the Southern California area doing concerts and stuff like that. But we also did a lot of background vocal stuff for commercials. So yeah, I did have some enjoyment as a professional vocalist. I ended up getting married to a woman that I had met out there. She had grown up in Boulder, and she had just gotten through her divorce when we met and eventually got married, but she just wanted to go home to Boulder. And that's how I had that connection to Boulder. I helped load up the truck, and we all moved to Boulder and lived in her parents' house on the hill. I started roofing, hated that because I was freezing in the winter and burning up in the summer, and started looking for another job. And Lafayette Police Department had placed an ad in the paper that they were looking for patrol officers. And long story short, I got hired out of 500 and some odd applicants. It was a huge applicant pool. Somehow the chief liked me, and some of the other staff that was involved in the oral boards and some of the people from city council just kind of took a liking to me, and I got hired. Spent 3 years in patrol, and my whole goal in being a cop was to be a detective, and convinced my chief that I should be allowed to try and be a detective about 2 years prior to where I should have been. So the general consensus was that you had to serve 5 years in patrol before you tried to be a detective. I begged and pleaded to be considered after 3 years, and my chief put me in as a detective. There's a long story behind how it happened, but I eventually became known as the child abuse investigator detective and domestic violence and sex assault rape investigator. It later became known as the family crimes unit, and it was me and one other detective. I was the lead investigator, and all my cases were those things: child abuse, child sex assault, domestic violence, adult rape, and adult sex assault, and then runaways. It wasn't a crime to be a runaway, but I was just assigned to help locate runaways. And those cases came to me. For some strange reason, I took a liking to those types of cases. I think because the arrest rate, if you do your job well, and if you like what you're doing, the arrest rate can be pretty high. And so I really enjoyed putting bad guys behind bars. Probably had a lot to do with the way I was raised. Kind of had a love for kids and protecting them and helping them and listening to them and letting them tell their stories without being interrupted, things like that. I developed a very keen interest in helping victims of domestic violence. And domestic violence became an educational springboard for me to understand how prevalent rape is within relationships. I don't think people still to this day realize that if you've got a domestic violence situation going, if there's assault going on in the relationship, the chances that there's also rape and sex assault going on in that same relationship is probably about 100%, although the research shows that it's at about 80%. I think a lot of that 20% that aren't talking about it don't consider it rape because they're married and they think that that's part of their marital duty. And the other aspect of it is it's embarrassing to say, yeah, he rapes me too. Yeah, I just read a lot and I talked to people who had expertise in that area and got materials from the Minnesota Project on Domestic Violence and got a lot of reading material from Pennsylvania Coalition Against Domestic Violence and the Pennsylvania Coalition Against Sexual Assault, because these were huge cornerstones of that research and of that investigative industry and caregiving and advocacy. So I did that for 15 years. After 3 years of patrol, 15 years as a detective, and decided to take early retirement and start my own training and consulting business because I had been utilized by my chief to train other agencies in those fields because his name was Leo Carrillo. I have to give a shout out to Leo. He was so active and pro-victim in domestic violence and rape cases. He was the head of the Colorado Victims' Rights Board. And what that board did was it reviewed all complaints from all departments in Colorado, regardless of what the complaint about law enforcement was. But the majority of the complaints that came in were from victims of domestic violence and rape for officers not treating victims right. So instead of taking punitive action, Leo's response was, let's train them right. Let's get them the education they need. And Dave, I want you to go train that agency. So he sent me all over the state of Colorado to train these different agencies that were getting complained about with regard to how they were investigating those cases. After doing that for a while, my caseload kept growing because I was out of town so much. And I'd come back to this, 10, 15 new cases on my desk. And I said, Leo, you've either got to stop sending me around the state to train or stop giving me new cases and let me just train. You go, no, you're doing great, Dave. Just keep do both.
You're fine.
So I did. I think I did that for another 2 or 3 years after I complained to him. And I just said, finally, I'm going to quit and become a full-time trainer instructor. That's what I did. Started my own training consulting business. The Army heard about me a few years later. I got hired by the Army to be what's called a highly qualified expert and worked for the Criminal Investigative Division of the Army, helped design and co-managed the 2-week Special Victims Unit Investigations course that was taught both there at Leonard Wood, where I was at Fort Leonard Wood in South Central Missouri, where I was stationed. We did that same course at the Federal Law Enforcement Training Center in Glencoe, Georgia. And so I was back and forth between Missouri and Georgia quite a bit. That education process for me as a highly qualified expert was more of an education for me than it was me teaching them. I got to work with some very, very intelligent, high-level psychologists, research people in the field of sex assault and rape and domestic violence issues, interpersonal violence. And that's where I got the majority of my trauma-informed education and what it meant to be trauma-informed and how the brain reacts to trauma. So I got a lot of neuroscience because I was working side by side with some amazing people, including Dr. David Lesak, Dr. Jim Hopper, Dr. Kim Lonsway from the End Violence Against Women International organization, which trains law enforcement. There are several others that I worked with, and just I valued that education. And after I finished my assignment as a highly qualified expert, which is a 5-year appointment with a 1-year renewal period if you're doing well, and I did get renewed. It was an honor. But when those 6 years were up, I left Fort Leonard Wood, moved back to southern Utah, and was convinced to start a podcast and do my training from that aspect and try and help people become trauma informed and also to help people understand the neuroscience of the brain and what our brains do when we go through such severe trauma.
Before we continue our conversation, I want to share a resource that could be really important for some of you listening. If you are a survivor and you're feeling exhausted, disconnected, like you're trying so hard to heal and it's still not working, you are not broken and you're not doing it wrong. It's just that traditional healing methods often focus on the symptoms of trauma, but they miss a key part of the picture: the brain and the nervous system. That's what makes Break Free from CPTSD, a program by R.C. Gray and Survivor School, so different. It's a neuroscience-based, trauma-informed program that helps you actually complete the trauma cycle, not just cope with it. Over 6 weeks, the program helps you regulate your nervous system, rebuild a felt sense of safety, and restore your brain's executive functions. I'm talking about focus, planning, and motivation, the parts of you that trauma tends to shut down. This isn't therapy, but it is a step-by-step roadmap that works with your brain and body. If you've ever felt like your trauma recovery is stuck, this might be the piece you've been missing. We know that not every path of healing works for every survivor, but we also know that you can live a full life after sexual assault. So if you're feeling stuck in your healing journey, this resource might just be the path for you. Check out the link in the show notes for free access to a 3-part training that breaks down how trauma affects your brain and how to actually start rewiring it. And what they don't say listeners who check out the free training will be automatically entered into a lottery where one survivor will win access to the Break Free from CPTSD summer session free of charge. Click the link in the show notes to learn more. Now back to our conversation.
The worst trauma I think that humans can endure is rape. And I know you guys can speak to that. I think it's worse than losing a loved one. I think it's worse than combat. I think it's worse than pretty much anything that we can endure, because all of those things that I just mentioned are things that humans understand are part of life. What we don't understand, what our brains don't wrap around at all, is having our personal bodies, personal spaces, personal intimacies violated in a rape situation. And I think there's research that backs up that if you encounter a person who's experienced all kinds of traumas, like combat, like a death of a child, for instance, if they lost an infant right after birth or something like that, and they were also raped, and you ask those people to rate which of those traumas was the worst, the majority of them list the rape at the top.
Oh, yeah.
Not everybody, and I'm not saying it is the worst thing. I'm not saying that exclusively. I'm saying that it's predominantly considered probably the worst thing that can happen to a human. And you alluded to that too, Shannon, in how it froze you and prevented you from being an athlete.
Yeah. I frequently think that it would be easier to go through my dad dying again than go through being assaulted and the court case and going through all of that. You had just said that there's proof of this, that people tend to, if you were to rate your traumas on a scale, that being raped is one of the top ones. And a lot of times I justify things like, oh, I was so young when my dad died, so maybe it would be different. But with my trauma knowledge that I have, and when I say trauma knowledge, I mean all of my different experiences, I think that being raped was far worse than losing my dad.
I also feel like the responses you get from other people is so vastly different, because everyone rallies around you and is like, we're going to help you get through this. Maybe it's annoying that you have so much support. Maybe you want all those people to get away. But then when you go through something like rape or sexual assault, it is so personal and so intimate. You're not going to be telling all these people, most likely. And so you're not going to have that same sort of understanding and support. And so it's just a trauma that society doesn't understand, like how we understand death. And so it's a really weird thing that it's almost so hard to compare it because of how society responds to it. When someone in your family dies, no one's going to come up to you and be like, you're lying. What's wrong with you?
Right.
This is your fault. No one's going to have that response. But then when you say, oh, I've been raped, it's totally different. People are going to attack you and not support you. And that's terrifying to know that's even an option that could happen.
There are two major components of being raped that experts and victims and survivors alike agree on as being the most re-traumatizing of the experience of being raped. Those two things are not being believed, which you just mentioned, and being blamed. for your own rape. And I know you guys can relate to that. Let's talk about being blamed for your own rape.
I was actually thinking about a particular experience with a person that we both experienced blame from, and that would be my mother. When I first told my mother, it was just a few days after I'd been assaulted. I had already had a therapy appointment set up just because I was going to therapy every week, and it just so happened that I had been assaulted a few days prior, so it was quite timely. And when I told my therapist, she said, "You have to tell your mother. And you need to tell your mother because you're going to be experiencing a long list of side effects, and your mom has to know." And so we scheduled another appointment for my mom to be there and for me to be there and my therapist to be there to have a sort of mediator. And I say, "Mom, I was raped." And I start going through what happened and I just word vomit everything that happened. And the first thing she said is, "You were drinking?" Not, "Oh my God, I'm so sorry. Oh my gosh, are you okay? I love you." Just, "You were drinking?" That was the immediate, like, this is exactly why I didn't want to tell you, because I knew you were going to focus on the wrong thing. And I just remember being so confused about, like, well, confused and validated in the same point of, I knew she would react that way because my mother has a history of not responding in the correct quote unquote way. But at the same time, just so horrible of, like, I can't believe that you're not coming over here to give me a hug or anything like that. And I do have to note that there were a lot of things that she did a lot better later on. You know, she learned, she had never experienced anything like this, but to have, like, the first quote unquote real adult that I had told, who was my mother, respond with, "You were drinking." And then if you hadn't drank, then maybe this wouldn't have happened to you, which was something she told me a couple weeks later. I mean, it made me want to go back into my shell.
Made you want to drink some more.
Which I did. Yes, exactly. Precisely.
I wasn't trying to make a joke. It's a common response.
This is like kind of a tangent, but I want to add this in because the response Shannon's mom had is not a unique response. You know, we see that all the time, and especially from older generations that didn't talk about these things. I think that your mom, Shannon, has come a really long way since then. And I think, like, one of the moments that I learned that it was over the summer, and we were all in Tahoe. It was me, Shannon, my mom, my dad, and then Shannon's mom. We were at dinner, like at a restaurant, and my dad was talking about one of his father's colleagues or something like that, and how great of a guy he was, and how he was such an asset to my grandfather, and all this stuff. And then Shannon's mom is like, "He was a predator towards me."
Yeah.
You know, she came out and said it, which was very courageous, and I really respected her for that. But then my dad's response was, "Oh, what are you talking? Like, he was such a nice guy. Like, he was so great to me." And I was like, "Well, you were a, like, white man in America, and, like, just because you had this great experience with him doesn't mean he wasn't capable of being a predator and doing disgusting things to, like, a 14-year-old girl," which your mom was at the time. And so I stood up for her and I was like, "Dad, that's bullshit. A lot of murderers are super nice to people, but then they can turn around and murder people." And it's the same thing with rapists and predators. And that's exactly what happened in this case. And so I stood up for her. And I remember, I think after that trip, getting a text from Shannon's mom, like, just really thanking me for standing up for her and for having her back in that situation. You know, it's been a journey with your mom, Shannon, obviously, because she did place a lot of blame on me as well, because I didn't speak up after it happened to me. And then Shannon's assault was after mine, and it was with the same person that assaulted me. And so she put a lot of blame on me for that. But I think that as we've had conversations with her, and as she has learned, and as she has had the ability to open up about her own experiences, she's just been way more informed and has learned way more about how to respond to all these different things, which can sometimes feel impossible to respond to. It's been definitely a journey with your mom, but she's definitely made a lot of headway.
Thank you. I'm sure my mom would love to hear that. I also like to note that I think parents, especially parents of daughters, are so afraid of something like this happening to their child. And then when it does happen, I think a lot of times they realize, oh, I couldn't protect them from everything. This is, like, the one thing that I really didn't want to happen, and it happened. And so for a mom to be able to blame you or somebody else in our circle who had also been assaulted before I was assaulted by the same guy, it would be much easier for her to do that than to try to take on that blame, when in reality, like, it's not her fault, it's not my fault, it's not your fault, it's the perpetrator's fault. But for a parent, they might feel like they've failed, and so that's the only thing that they know what to resort to, is blaming other people.
Spot on. Absolutely. We could talk about just the victim blaming aspect of rape and sex assault the rest of the day and into tomorrow easily, because it is such a huge aspect of what I call rape culture. So let's talk a little bit about rape culture. My issue with victim blaming and rape culture is rape and sex assault is different than any other crime. I'm not talking about, yes, it's a horrible thing to do to another person, but it's also a crime. Okay. And
Right.
so let's think about it in the category of where it is in the criminal justice system. It's a felony. Most societies around the world consider rape a serious felony, but yet there is a completely different mindset when the judicial system and our society as a whole look at rape and blame the victim. And we treat rape differently than any other crime. Can you think of one other crime where the victims get blamed as much as they do with rape? There's two situations as a former detective that come to mind where I heard a lot of victim blaming. One was car trespass. Well, if you had locked your car, right, which is a fallacy, because I investigated umpteen car trespass cases where multiple cars in a, for instance, apartment complex parking lot parked right next to each other had many cars that were locked, and the offender just broke the window. So no, just locking your car doesn't keep your car safe from being trespassed. The other is burglary. Well, if you'd locked your windows and your doors, or if you'd had an alarm system, this wouldn't have happened. Again, total fallacy. When it comes to rape and sex assault, you don't hear the pushback from blaming a victim like you do in those other two cases, which are easily pointed out as the fallacy of victim blaming. No, it's not the victim's fault, but it seems to stick so much more with rape and sex assault. And we don't do that with any other crime. Do you have a theory on why?
In this society, we trust men more than we trust women, especially when they're men in power. And we would rather disprove and not believe female victims specifically. Obviously, there are nuances and there's a lot going on in this realm, but just when I'm focusing on male on female rape, we live in a society that we like villainize women because of our emotions, because of our quote unquote need for attention. There's that aspect of it. And I just think that as a society, we would rather believe men, especially men in power, than take the time to believe survivors, especially because if we believe survivors, then we have to acknowledge the fact there's a problem. And there's a problem within our government, and there's a problem within our judicial system, and all these different things. And people like to live under a rock and be ignorant as fuck.
Absolutely. Totally agree. I'm going to throw another ingredient into that batter that you just mentioned, Lauren. I have a firm theory, belief system that what we're talking about here in terms of victim blaming and not believing victims, which are the two big, like I said, issues of re-victimizing rape and sex assault victims, is that this issue of rape and sex assault goes back millennia to the beginning of time, to the beginning of recorded human history. And very, very little has changed in terms of how society and culture, different cultures, including many others than our American society and culture, victim blame and disparage and minimize and marginalize women. It's in our DNA. It's like a default. Blame the victim. Don't believe the victim. Give credit where credit is due to the perpetrator. It was a misunderstanding. It was regret sex. That's why she's reporting it as a rape. Now she regrets that she had sex in the first place. All of the things that you hear about in today's culture have existed since recorded history beginning. I really think we have a huge road to hoe in terms of how we fix that.
so many aspects of that are just ingrained in how we grow up too, especially as girls turning into women. And you go to school and you have a dress code that's like, you can't show your shoulders, or you can't wear like a skirt that's above your knees or whatever it might be. And then we learn that it's our fault if men sexualize us,
Right.
and it's our fault if they're looking at us, instead of just teaching boys that that's not okay to do and teaching them how to have like some sort of self-control. And so there's just always been this responsibility on young women to cover up because it's mandated by their school, or to whatever it might be, like just this idea that women are supposed to satisfy men's needs and not the other way around. Or it's just all these things that we are taught growing up in society, and they just build and build and build and build, and then all intertwine into this rape culture. I think that's something that we haven't seen really change.
You're reminding me of a story. Back in the day, for myself, when I was attending school in person and not online yet, we had a dress code, and it was a pretty strict dress code. And there was a semester where like girls were getting dress coded, like 50% of the women in our class, in our whole grade, were getting dress coded. And it was specifically for spaghetti straps or your shorts being too short. It was second semester, and so, it's warm outside, Albuquerque, New Mexico, it's hot. The person who was dress coding all of these girls was this like 62-year-old man. And I wish I could remember his name. We'll just call him Mr. D right now. Yeah, he literally was dress coding all of these women. And we're all upset. We're all like specifically wearing shorter shorts because we're angry. We're like, well, he can't dress code the whole grade. Yeah, he could. He was doing that. And one day there was this girl named Ella, and she says, I'm going to go talk to Mr. D, because how do you think he's dress coding us? What do you think he's having to do to get to that point to dress code us? And we're like, oh, Ella, what a great idea. I've never even thought about that. So she stomped her little butt into his room, into his office, and all of us girls were standing outside. And she said, Mr. D, I would like you to walk us through exactly how you dress code girls. And he says, well, I first need to figure out the length of their shorts. And she said, well, Mr. D, how do you do that? He says, well, I'm looking at their thighs. Remember, we're freshmen in high school. So what are we, like 13, 14-year-old girls? First, I'm looking at their thigh. Oh, you're looking at their thigh. Well, how far up their thigh are you looking? Well, I have to look up as short as the shorts are. And he's just, blatantly, it's this 6-year-old man looking at all of these girls in basically a very inappropriate way is what it came down to. And we all were cheering and being really aggressive about it, and we all got in trouble. But ultimately, it resulted in them making it so only female teachers could dress code females, and then vice versa for men. Which obviously doesn't fully solve the problem. But I remember it was just so blatantly obvious that this older man was looking at very young girls' body parts really up close.
With an excuse, a pretense excuse of doing what he was doing. Absolutely. So rape culture, in my mind.
I have a question for you two. How do you feel about rape jokes in the context of you making them, other people making them, comedians making them? What do you think?
Lauren? I have an answer, but I want to hear yours.
I think that this is actually a complicated question, because it's really interesting when you listen, or like you're watching stand-up comedy and things like that, and a lot of dark jokes are made, and they make fun of a lot of different issues that plague humanity in different ways. And that's part of the reason why it's funny, right? You create humor out of something really terrible. And that's something that like me and Shannon have done a lot of, especially as we've gone through our different traumas, is that we find the humor that's in it. And we just use that to survive. I think that, when comedians go up on stage and they're making really dark jokes about like their sister that died, or, whatever it might be, it can be really funny. I think the issue I have with rape jokes is that there's already so much ignorance when it comes to the topic of rape, and there's so much misunderstanding. When you go up and you make a joke about death, people have an understanding of death and what that means to people and how that impacts people. But when you go up and you make a joke about rape, there just isn't that level of understanding. Even if you're someone who has experienced it yourself, like there's just not enough conversations about it to shed this light on it. And so it almost feels like super ignorant to make rape jokes because of just how taboo and like closed off it is. And I don't know, like it's definitely one of those things where like I can handle dark humor, but I do have a problem with it. Like I'm not like specifically sure why, but maybe it just feels like we're making jokes about something, but then we can't even have real conversations about it.
But we've made jokes about it. That's why I'm like, well, I don't want to answer this question necessarily, though. I want to hear your guys' opinions. But sorry, I spoke too soon. Just
But Shannon, you and I are making like jokes about our own experiences to ourselves and to each other.
well, and then uploading it to the internet, though.
I think there's like levels of it though. You know what I mean? Like there are definitely levels of rape jokes for sure.
True. Very true.
Like Lauren said, I think it's a very complicated question. And to hear you guys say and admit, and I've heard it myself on your podcast episodes where you joke about rape among yourselves, about yourselves, your own rapes. And yes, you're right, Shannon, those do go out to the world. But I think it does something psychologically different when two victims among themselves and on a show that talks about the horrors and atrocities of rape and sex assault, it's understood that when you start joking about it, it's a coping mechanism. It's an option that you take in order to really obtain some sort of therapeutic value out of it. When you asked the question, Shannon, my mind immediately went to the professional stand-up comedian or even the semi-professional, somebody that does it periodically, who is making that type of joke. I get tremendously offended and upset, probably because of my personal experience with rape and sex assault, in addition to my dad making fun of me as I was growing up through his emotional abuse to me and seeing the impact it had on me. He would kind of rub my nose, as a figure of speech, into whatever it was that was upsetting me based on what he was doing to emotionally traumatize me. He recognized when I was upset, and he'd make it worse by zeroing in on that and amplifying it. When a stand-up does it on a stage, the reason I get so upset, as I mentioned, this probably had to do with some of that, but also because of my professional background as an investigator, a law enforcement official who is trying to help victims and survivors, number one, tell their story to begin with in such a way that I can obtain enough evidence to hopefully take action against the perpetrator, but then also to get enough evidence to bring into court. When people start joking about that from a professional capacity, I think, oh man, how uneducated they really are. Even if they are victims themselves of rape or sexual assault and are using that as a platform for their own therapy, it just doesn't ring true to me as a appropriate way to get a laugh. To me, there's nothing funny about a stand-up comedian talking in dark and humorous or attempted humorous ways about something so devastating and so difficult, in my mind, propagates the rape culture.
Rape culture.
Dave, when you were talking, it kind of like helped me get to my conclusion of it's like society already thinks that rape is a joke.
Mm-hmm.
Don't turn it into more of a joke. I think that's why it pisses me off.
Yeah, it exacerbates an already existing horrific problem.
I think you guys explained it really well, but we got a comment one time and it was like all caps. I think it was on Lauren's sexual assault story episode. And the comment was like, how dare you laugh about this? Rape is a serious thing. And my first thought was like, oh God, my worst fear was coming alive of people thinking that we're not taking this seriously. But then I had to remind myself, we started the podcast because we wanted to be able to have candid conversations about this. And if we're laughing about other stuff, it's not to take away the seriousness of it, but because the laughing, I think, is combined with the true core of what is actually going on. And we do talk about it in a serious way as well. I think that that's kind of what makes it okay, is that it's done in tandem, maybe.
You're like not making a joke about the act of rape, right? Like we make jokes surrounding our experiences so we can like get through it. I mean, we've talked about this stuff so much, but like it's still sometimes uncomfortable to go like relive your own experiences. So yeah, you throw a giggle in there. I giggled, and I'm saying giggle for a reason, okay? Because it wasn't a laugh. Like when I told my dad what happened to me, I was so uncomfortable that I was sitting on my couch giggling
Mm-hmm.
because that was the only way I could think to get through it. Like,
Yeah, I
that was
cannot.
it.
Absolutely. I can't tell you how many times investigators that I've worked with and that I've seen and I've observed or even talked to about their experiences have said something along these lines. Well, when she was telling me as an investigator about her rape, she kept laughing about it. She giggled all the way through it. She laughed about it. She was smiling. She was like, no big deal almost. And if it really had happened, this is their logic. If it really had happened, they wouldn't be laughing about it. Well, that's just a complete misunderstanding of human psychological response for some people to trauma. People laugh about being in an airplane crash. People laugh about being in a car crash. People laugh about dead baby jokes all the time, right?
Oh, yeah.
Those were a big thing back when I was in college. Everybody told dead baby jokes. Not funny to me. I don't know. Some people think they're funny, but it's just, to me, there's limits. And
Mhm.
I think probably makes me say not funny and there's limit is because I understand quite a bit about why our brains do what the brains do. It's a neurological phenomenon. It's a psychological, neurological, psychophysiological response to trauma. It's a wall. It's a coping mechanism. It's a way of dealing with something that's extremely painful. You've heard the expression, I'm laughing because it hurts too much to cry.
I don't know. I don't know if anyone. This is gonna
I'm
sound so
not
terrible.
laughing.
This is gonna sound so bad, but it's like, okay, in college and like high school and stuff, it can be like really hard to get out of classes. They make it impossible for you to like miss a class. I'm sure. I don't know. I don't know if Shannon's done this, but like you like tell a lie, like you say something bad happened so that like you can get out of a class, okay? And you're not going to walk into your professor and start laughing when you're telling them this like lie to get out of a class. You're probably going to be like so solemn and so like uncomfortable and sad. You know what I mean? And it's like, if someone was lying about getting assaulted, you really think that they would be sitting there laughing? No, they would be like garnering all their acting abilities to act as sad as they possibly can, which, like, obviously, when people tell the stories, like, sometimes they are very, very sad, of course, of course. But, like, it's like they're not going to be sitting there laughing. I feel like that is an indicator of like telling the truth because you're just so deeply uncomfortable, so actually sad that there's no other option than to laugh, which obviously this is a general statement. Not everyone acts that way when they tell their stories. But for me and Shannon, that's kind of just how it was and how it felt.
That's how we roll. I'm curious, Dave, if you can tell us a bit about kind of the long-term impacts of sexual trauma. I'm definitely asking for myself and not a friend. um, I've noticed that recently I've become significantly more anxious, and just like a lot of things that I've been experiencing in my personal life have been like, whoa, I definitely need to get back into therapy. And I don't know if it's connected to my sexual trauma or if it's just me growing up and my frontal lobe developing. So, yeah, what could you tell us about the long-term impacts of sexual trauma in the brain?
How much time do you have?
Well,
So
I guess, yeah, do the best that you can.
it's a phenomenally good question. It's a phenomenally difficult question to answer, but there is some recent research, and I would guess that you've probably heard about it because it hit the news, I don't know, 5, 6 years ago, even though the research itself is probably 10 years old. It took a while for it to surface and make its way through social media and major media. And that research is that rape and sex assault has such a deep impact on the human psyche that it impacts our interpersonal relationships. It impacts our marital relationships, which are the interpersonal relationships. It impacts our work product. It impacts our ability to make a good income. It impacts our physical health, obviously impacts our mental health. To what degree? That all depends upon the individual. You just brought up a very interesting aspect of all of that is why right now am I feeling a a lot more anxiety than I was maybe 6 months ago or a year ago about the rape. Why is the rape kind of center in my mind, almost maybe to the same extent it was shortly after it happened? It varies from person to person as to why, but it goes to show that the way our cognitive and emotional functioning works is kind of like ocean waves. It ebbs and flows. And what those, I don't like the word triggers, but what those activators are can vary immensely. As you just mentioned, you said, well, I don't know if it's because of some of the stuff I'm going through personally right now. I don't know if it's because of work. I don't know if it's because my studies are bugging me and I'm already feeling anxiety. But when those tiny little memories come to mind about my rape or sex assault, all of a sudden they seem amplified and they seem center focus and they seem very, very intrusive and obsessive in the way I'm thinking right now. I know there's a science to it because that's what I'm referring to in this research. But even scientists and psychologists that study this stuff, as I just mentioned, don't know what those activators are. And it's so individual and so unique for each person. As you know, there are some people who maybe have been raped, sometimes even in some pretty atrocious, physically painfully harmful ways that seem to just float through it. Doesn't seem to bother them. They say, yeah, I was raped and it was horrible and I was in the hospital and I went through a little bit of therapy. I'm fine now. And they may actually be telling the truth. They might be fine and it may not ever impose itself into their daily thought function at all, their cognitive functioning and their ability to perform in whatever aspect they're performing in, work, relationships, health. Yet there are others who maybe experienced what most people would consider a minor sexual assault of being slapped on the butt by some guy that was riding by on a bicycle. And they go into emotional breakdown. They curl up on the floor in a fetal position. They cannot function, as you were referring to and saying when you were raped, you couldn't even skate anymore. Well, some people do that from just what others would consider a minor sex assault. But to them, because of where they were cognitively, what their education level is, what their sophistication level is, what their emotional mindset was when it happened, there's so many varying factors that it can have this devastating impact. I wish I had a really good answer for you. But I think the answer is understand that there is no good answer, but that it's normal to feel the way you're feeling. You're one of millions of people who might be feeling the same exact way at any given moment because of what you experienced. An important aspect to look at this too is that if you take all of the anxiety that you have and that maybe you're referring to as we talk about this very topic and eliminate the fact that you were raped, would you still be feeling the same level of anxiety and stress and side effects of physical illness and fatigue and shutdown? And well, very possibly, yes. It may have absolutely nothing to do with the fact that you experienced a rape. But my theory is that if you are feeling all of those anxieties and there is just that small activator of some type that intrudes itself into the neuropaths of that anxiety that has anything to do with your rape, it's going to exacerbate it and amplify it exponentially. It kind of takes over your brain because of what we talked about before. Rape is so personal. Rape impacts every single cell in our body. Well, how do you know that, Dave? Well, because when you're raped, what our brain does in trauma and how the brain functions with the limbic system, the amygdala, the hippocampus, the hypothalamus, all those really intricate internal, way deep down inside of the brain limbic system parts reacts is to, they call it the fear cascade. Our bodies just become awash in these hormones that we have absolutely no control over. It's all automatic. It's all biologically impossible to control. Those same chemicals are released when we have a minor stress, like we can't find our keys and we're late for an appointment, as when we're raped, The difference is the amount of those chemicals that flush through our bodies. When those chemicals are released, where do they go? Well, they start in areas of your brain like the pituitary gland. They come from even your thyroid gland. They come from all sorts of places where hormones are excreted from throughout our body. And where do they go? Into the bloodstream. And what happens when they go into our bloodstream? Our blood circulates through our entire body. So even the smallest fraction of your left toenail experiences a level of those chemicals. So that's why I say it impacts every cell in your body, because our blood system supplies every cell in our body. And when you think about it that way, it makes a whole lot more sense as to why we have something called the body keeps the score, right?
Yes.
Yep.
Our bodies psychophysiologically have memory of especially traumatic experiences. Did that answer your question at all? I don't know. This probably made it more complicated.
Well, it is complicated, but it's also a reminder that even if your conscious mind isn't thinking about the traumas you've been through, that doesn't mean your body isn't.
That's absolutely right.
I think it's so easy. Like if you're having a bad day or feeling really anxious or depressed, it's so easy to try to find a single reason why.
Mm-hmm.
And then when we can't, it's annoying because we're like, then what's wrong with me? Like, why am I in such a bad mood today? Nothing bad happened to me. Nothing inconvenient happened. Like, why am I in such a bad mood? And you have to remind yourself that like that anxiety is coming from places within our body, from things that have just like happened to us over our lives. And it's important to like give yourself grace in that too, because that's also like a way you heal. If you just try to pinpoint random reasons for why you can be in a bad mood, you're kind of just in this lost goose chase kind of.
One of the things that really helps us deal with our anxiety and overwhelming feelings is having someone who understands what we've been through, who knows some, maybe not a lot, but just something about human trauma and the psychophysiological responses of the brain and the neuroscience of the brain, just even a small amount of knowledge, who is willing to, even if it's just figuratively, wrap their arms around you and say, it's okay. It's normal. You're going to be all right. I am here with you. I'm holding you, even if it is just figuratively. I'm here for you. Use me to help you. Help me help you get through this. Tell me what I can do. Tell me what you need to help alleviate, even if it's just a tiny amount of alleviation. Help me help you alleviate some of what you're feeling. And the research shows that too has a tremendous impact on our recovery rate and our recovery amount. Not just how fast we recover, but to what extent that recovery occurs. And so I just want to wrap my arms around both of you right now.
Thanks, Dave.
First of all, and tell you I am really sorry for the experiences that you both lived through in your rape and sex assault experiences. I empathize with you, and I really do have a deep understanding of what that feels like to you. And I really have a deep understanding of why people joke about it, including listening to you guys talk about it. And I'm thankful that you do. And I'm thankful that you talk about it, because others need to hear that you respond to your trauma that way, because they may be doing the same thing and then have guilt feelings about it, have shame about it. And I don't want them to. I want them to know that's normal. Mm-hmm. So thank you guys. I'm sorry for what happened, but thank you for sharing what you've been through and how that process works, what that healing looks like. It's really, truly a pleasure, which is a weird word to apply to rape and sex assault podcasts. It's a pleasure to listen to your podcast.
Thank you, Dave. Thanks for all that you do. And you're so like calming. I feel like you could do a meditation podcast and I would listen to that too. I feel like at ease right now.
Thank you guys for spending this time with me, letting me be on your show and for being on mine.
Thank you guys so much for listening. We love you all. We hope you have a great rest of your week. We'll catch you on the flip side, and cheers.
Cheers.
Cheers.